Welcome to this episode of the ATARC Federal IT Podcast Series on the role of the federal government in supporting and securing agency operations under current operating conditions, which for many organizations and their employees are a mix of remote and in-person or hybrid operations, and in whatever mix of remote and in-person, and in whatever mix of remote and in-person operations we'll have in the new normal. I'm Jim Richberg, the Field Chief Information Officer at Fortinet and your host for this series. Now, in this series to date, we've heard from agencies such as the General Services Administration and the Office of Personnel Management. We're switching gears. My guest today is Michael Fagan, who is a computer scientist with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, and who is the technical lead for NIST's Cybersecurity for IoT program. Mike, thanks for joining me on this podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So, Mike, to get us started, what can you tell your audience about the mission and functions of NIST? And then how did you come to NIST? How long have you been there?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, thanks again for having me here today. I'm always happy to talk about our work and NIST in general and what NIST does. It's a great agency. I say that not cheesily. They fill a really special role in the government in many ways. When you talk to folks who are in certain sectors of industry in particular, I think you hear a lot of praise about NIST, and I've learned that since joining them. I knew them out of just kind of general interest and thought it would be interesting and cool, honestly, to work for them. But over time, when I interact with folks in the private sector, in academia, sometimes more commonly outside of cybersecurity, you hear, NIST, yeah, they're great. NIST documents, they're great. They're useful, so helpful. And that's really what we strive to be in the just general for science and technology. That's not what the S stands for, of course, that being standards, which is another key role NIST plays for the US government, as sort of we represent the United States in international standards bodies, and we have counterparts in other nations that we work with. We'll get into that a little bit more later. All towards developing international standards for all sorts of things. I know when I first started, they give you the example of standard reference peanut butter for certain levels of crunchiness and creaminess and things like that. And from maybe a bygone era standard reference cigarettes and things of that nature. NIST really, and other organizations in other countries as well, play a really interesting role in across science and across technology, helping to agree internationally on what is what, down to really fundamental things like measurement and standard units and things like that. So that's, I kind of went expansive, but in general, our goal is to promote innovation and industrial competitiveness of the United States. And so in that area for cybersecurity and in IoT and in technology, more specifically computer technology, sometimes it's not always developing standards. Our team does some of that. A lot of times it's providing guidance and sort of mile markers and milestones that folks across industry and across academia can use in their own work.
Yeah.
Again, the person. Oh, go.
No, I was going to say, I think that it's a testament to the value of what NIST does, that although the focus of your standards are really the government, right? You're really the setting standards in many cases in cybersecurity for the government. The cybersecurity framework, the risk management framework are really tools for government to use, but they have de facto, you're hard pressed to find someone in the private sector who isn't familiar with the NIST cybersecurity framework and who doesn't look at the world through that lens. So I think that shows the sort of nonpartisan, vendor agnostic approach and the value of what you guys bring to it. So how did you get there?
Yeah, I was going to get on the personal level. I started when I was doing my PhD work, looking for internships like all PhD students are, trying to get outside of the lab a little bit and see more of what's out there, especially in the area of computer science. And work with NIST came up in my search. And as I said, I was always sort of keen and interested. So I jumped in and haven't left since then and transitioned out of my PhD work. And so that was in 2016, I started the internship. And at that time, I was working in the identity space, digital identity.
Sure.
So my background is in usable security, doing research around why individuals might not be their best around cybersecurity, both common users, but also enterprise, individuals, not keeping that software up to date, not having secure passwords. That we can all grab at the obvious reasons. My research is trying to dig into that a little bit more, and so they pulled me into the identity work to help think about the contours of what they were developing at that time around sort of this usable security realm. And then in 2018, as I transitioned more into NIST's work full-time after I graduated with my PhD, I started to work in IoT and have been in that ever since with the Cybersecurity for IoT program, helping to develop guidance in IoT cybersecurity.
Okay, well, this has certainly been a monumental year in terms of cybersecurity, and a lot coming out of the federal government. And
Definitely.
of course, notably among the things has been the executive order that President Biden signed in May, Executive Order 14028. And it has a number of things it assigns the lead to NIST for execution of. So what is NIST's role in the cyber EO that the president signed this year?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Happy to give a little bit of detail on that. I'm, as they say in the government, above my pay grade in a lot of ways, all the response to that.
Yeah.
But the bit I can say, as NIST very commonly does, frankly, we're giving technical guidance in response to that EO. Section 4 specifically directs NIST to solicit input from many groups, private sector, academia, government agencies, and whoever else may be interested in the areas of developing or using existing standards, tools, best practices, and other guidelines to increase the software supply chain or the cybersecurity of the software supply chain, I should say, broadly. So understood, it's well outside of IoT in many ways. There's a lot of work going on that NIST is trying to pull, or is actively pulling together. I will say beyond trying, I know we are executing on getting together a lot of work in response to this EO to then hand off to others who will work to, as also commonly happens, work to develop it based on NIST's guidance and with our continued input, of course, because we're always here to help, as they say. So I know our very specific group work, the Cybersecurity for IoT program, has been developing a report in response to this EO that is discussing the contours. I'll keep using that word, considerations. In some cases, we get a little bit more specific than considerations about a consumer IoT labeling program and how that might be built up. NIST doesn't intend to build this program. We're not directed to. We're directed to develop the guidance for it. And so our team has been working very, very diligently of recent on putting together a series of incremental reports, building towards that final report in response to the EO that'll come out early next year, to calendar year, that is. That will help, we hope, spur work by maybe other public or maybe even hopefully private sector organizations to start adopting these, at least adopting the concepts, of course, but maybe even develop out the labeling program itself to give consumers the choice that the executive order is really driving at least the parts that we've been working towards.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's striking that, if you look at the executive order, it talks about the definition of critical software, which NIST provided. That's a way of, and that links up to the software bill of materials idea that you essentially have the equivalent of the nutrition label on the side of a food package that tells you, much as you know what ingredients are in here, what the components in that software are. And then, of course, as you said, the equivalent of the Energy Star rating that you might be able to say gives people the ability to make a more informed decision as they purchase things, including IoT. Now, of course, recently, the president signed the bipartisan infrastructure and jobs bill, which gives $1.2 billion to improving infrastructure. And I've got to say, that's going to touch IoT. So why is IoT security a topic of interest for the federal government now?
Well, as you just highlighted, that's a great lead into what I was going to say, even just dry. These days, whatever you're talking about can be connected a lot of times. It might be weak, it might not, and I mean that not necessarily in a judgmental way, just the smart benefits might not always be as whiz bang as the front door camera even. It's very minor maybe. Just getting that data when normally an individual would have to go up to the device and put a sensor to it. Now we can pull it all at once. seemingly that's incremental in terms of, I think, the system engineering convenience benefit relative to what maybe some home consumer IoT benefits are. At the same time, there certainly exists industrial applications, like you say, infrastructure applications that are whiz bang and maybe large deployments of sensor networks, say, that are in response to the climate crisis and climate change and the need to adapt in real time responses. And the federal government, of course, is interested in all of that, as you could imagine. I think that goes without even needing expertise in the area. Responses to disasters can be aided by things like IoT and sensor networks that can hopefully be resilient to such a storm, but then allow first responders to more quickly locate, identify, and rescue those who are stranded. Just one completely off the top of my head, thinking of recent events out of the news and where IoT maybe today doesn't play a role, but I can probably guess that those first responders are strapped up with some IoT devices, federal first responders, that it's pervasive, not in a negative way, just in a way of seemingly overnight for some. We went from, I know how it all works, it's all a closed system, everything of my assumptions are correct, to, well, now the internet is connected to it and remote actors can change some things, and your assumptions become broken. Our kind of industry-wide assumptions start to break down. Yeah. And so the federal government is, due to just, kind of things that we see happening in both just computer technology broadly, right? Most recent news, right? The Log4j bug and concerns related to that, going back solar winds and infrastructure as well connected there, going even further back to Mirai and more IoT specific threats. The government is interested to get an understanding. I know NIST is interested to get an understanding of how we can approach proactively reducing these kinds of problems or their impacts. And I can say from our group's perspective, that's a big, keen interest of the federal government to put out guidance to help all parties, including the private sector, develop, in our case, more secure IoT products, and to then use them more securely as well as an enterprise. So the federal government as an enterprise, as they connect these things up and use them, as we sort of highlighted may be the case, but also, as the case with the executive order work, for home consumers to make better decisions, hopefully, and to then connect these all up in a more secure way as best as they can within their abilities.
Yeah, and you raise a key point on trying to improve the cybersecurity of IoT devices, because of course we recognize that a lot of these are lightweight, almost throwaway devices, the things we call headless devices, where they don't have strong intrinsic security and they can't be upgraded. So, A, the more work you can do at the front end to try to get security into them, or B, what NIST can do to help standardize ways to work around it with things like virtual patching, I would think have got to be critical parts of this solution. Do you agree?
Yes, yeah, certainly. With how do I put it, the form factor of IoT sometimes, I guess the way I like to really get to it is that the bolt-on security is really common these days, right? Like this idea of, I got this thing, how do I make it secure? Well, what would we use to make that secure? We got to do updates. All right, well, SD card in the side because there's not enough bandwidth that it gets to the update. Well, already it's blowing up the security. From my usable security background, you make it harder and harder and harder. An enterprise can, say, hey, got to do it. Unless it doesn't happen because, pragmatically, right? Like if it's too hard to do, even if you're ordered to do it, we all, somebody can't lift a boulder, even if people are whipping them to do that, right? So if it's not a task that's possible, and I'm not saying that's ever necessarily happened, it's just, it even goes up to the enterprise level, that unless security is thought of as part of the engineering process, the development process of the product, then redo that by a different entity, maybe at the system level when you're using that product, it's probably going to fall apart because it's going to be too bolt-on. And I think that's what you're getting at. To my mind, that's what you're getting at.
Well, I think
how we deliver security
Right.
as well as part of this.
And you raised Mirai, and of course, we still see exploitation of Mirai. And you remember, it targeted video cameras. It targeted
Yes.
these cheap, non-upgradable cameras where the password was password or admin, and they're still in use in a lot of home environments. And combine that with something like this Log4j vulnerability, and you have what essentially is an unclosable door into networks that don't even know they've got this vulnerability in there. And
Yeah, yeah. Response is very difficult when it comes to the scale of IoT. Then there are other mitigating factors that result in these sorts of vulnerabilities. Of course, sometimes just bonehead moves, many times maybe. But in the end, you said it ends up with a lot of bad stuff in the wild that's hard to get a grapple on. And to your point, maybe there are solutions that are appropriate in many cases. And I think things like remote over-the-air updates and the ability to push software updates, wherever that's possible in the use case, I would say is certainly a benefit to keeping vulnerabilities out. Does that make sense?
Well, in terms of NIST's role in being the standard setter for certainly the federal government, what unusual risks does the use of IoT present for federal agencies and their workers?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to, well, not trying to, but I was sort of thinking about when I was talking about the need to engineer security into a lot of IoT. IoT is strange. I think there's a pipeline process. Folks have really gotten great today, developers, I mean, and assembly lining the software development. I mean that in a good way. Product is brought to market. If you think back to, especially about lines of code written years ago, to lines of code in products now, because of the way it's all done, it's fast, it's quick, it's, there are vulnerabilities in general software. I'm not trying to talk up that it's great, of course, but hardware development just adds a layer to that makes it even more complex from a product delivery standpoint. Then that also has feedback implications for the software development process. It all become a mishmash, a bowl of spaghetti of challenges for organizations that if you then layer on top of that lack of expertise in one area or the other, they're a traditionally software company getting into a new market, serving I don't know, like you said, doorbells. We've made software, now we make doorbells, or vice versa. We've made the appliances for 150 years. Now they're connected to the internet. Every engineer we have is a mechanical engineer by trade. We've been, our internal expertise is around mechanical engineering. They could make the best washing machine you'd ever see out of the coolest materials that meets the best price point. But embedded systems are certainly not their forte. We have maybe some people that know that, but when it gets to cybersecurity and how to engineer that into a connected system, this is where it gets to be bolt on, right? They're just looking for maybe a quick fix for just getting this attached to what they're already putting together. But like I said, the vice versa, you're trying to adapt a software development process, an agile development process, to a hardware product. So you get it quick to market, just like we expect software to be quick to market today, with the expectation that we'll update it if there's a problem later. But if it's hardware based, if it's a change that ends up becoming very difficult because consumers, the customers themselves, enterprise or otherwise, are having trouble or are unable to apply the patch or update that you deliver as the manufacturer, it just becomes leaps and bounds, possibly then more dangerous. So all of that's that's just the kind of the marketplace issues with IoT. Then there's just what IoT is. It's not a laptop. It doesn't have a keyboard. Many times it doesn't have a mouse.
That's what makes it headless, right?
Yeah, like you mentioned, exactly. Yeah, it may die very quickly, and in the battery life, I mean, the energy requirements may be very low for the application, and therefore the device may be architected in a way that doesn't support cybersecurity as we know it. And the pipeline that we have for developing that kind of device or application breaks down with how we handle cybersecurity in our, you can't pull down the crypto library that you expect to be able to use. It requires a new skill set, frankly, from a software and hardware development standpoint, to, I think, mesh all these things together to execute. I think it's a bigger challenge than some people realize, and in some ways it's hard to get right, because you also have to balance it with the, which, I don't know, when I was years ago, there was an old adage about cybersecurity or security and convenience is sometimes a trade-off, many times a trade-off. And IoT is all about convenience.
Yeah.
It's all about making your life easier. So that means sometimes it's open security, unfortunately.
And it seems like in some parts of IoT, we're doing something just because we can, not because there's necessarily even a consumer-driven reason. I mean, we're all familiar with things like my refrigerator will be IoT connected and tell me when to buy milk on the way home, but I wouldn't be surprised if somebody's not marketing a planter that can tell you when the soil is dry and it's time. Do you need that? No, but I wouldn't be surprised if I went on Amazon and looked that I couldn't find probably an IoT connected planter,
Oh, this has become a mythic story now. That's funny you mentioned the planter, because it was a coworker of mine. I was at a workshop maybe a year or two ago, and I don't know if it was her or somebody else had used the planter as an example of, well, I have this planner that's
I thought I was being original, Mike.
and I don't have, and the example was being used. It wasn't her giving the example then, I guess, because the example was being used as, I don't care about the cybersecurity of the planter. I don't care if people know if my plant needs to be watered or doesn't or anything like that. The example, it's a bit off point from what you were saying. It's just funny that you mentioned the planter, because no matter what you try to think of as being original, because we've given up doing it. I just use generic terms for IoT products. Everything's IoT, all things, as you mentioned, and it makes it very, like you say, tempting. Hey, why not? Why not go for the cooler thing, newer thing? And that does create some challenges for cybersecurity sometimes.
Yeah, and again, we don't care if somebody's going to spoof that signal and my plant's going to die because it's dry. We care because it's a backdoor into the rest of my network, and it's probably got a 25-cent programmable logic chip in it that can't be upgraded. And that's what we worry about, I think, more than, people have talked about the refrigerator case where I keep going in and turning up the temperature and your milk goes bad and you're going to get botulism. But I think it's the fact that these things are introducing access to the network that makes a lot of these peripherals more threatening from a security.
Yeah, that's certainly, it's the potential for amplification because of the scale of IoT deployment. I'll use those terms very specifically. That really creates a concern when it comes to, cross horizontal attacks, where the attack doesn't care what it's connected to. It's just another conduit to the DDoS attack, to getting to something else in the network. But I would say, I think, that doesn't minimize, because, in a general risk management standpoint, you do think about financial impact of a cybersecurity threat. Now, if every piece of food in my fridge went bad, that impacts me as an organization. I'm an individual as a consumer. Now, like you're highlighting, right? Like, is there national security implications to that? Probably not. And that's maybe what you're saying. I don't think botulism is even likely. Bad milk, throwing out a lot of food would be bad. Right now, we're dealing with inflation. Maybe that's part of some sort of coordinated thing to drive prices up even higher. Everyone's food goes bad. But I don't think enough people have IoT fridges for that. And that's not even to scaremonger about them. I think it just becomes I would hope the businesses, like an industry, would care about that sort of concern, because it would make me not want to go out and buy the connected version, at least not from that brand, the second time around.
Yeah.
And so the general chill around IoT, I've heard that before. Concern about the too many security incidents can create a chill around the technology in general, which is certainly, again, towards competitiveness. NIST doesn't want to see that either. We want to see IoT, but secure, smartly deployed IoT, I think, as you're highlighting, Jim.
And I think, Mike, part of the problem is sometimes IoT comes embedded in things that we don't even realize have IoT. And the two examples I've heard recently from the federal government were otherwise reasonably locked down federal networks that had unidentified Wi-Fi signals coming out of them. One turned out to be the soft drink vending machine that was calling out when it needed to reorder, and another was a printer that was actually calling out to Staples or Office Depot to say, these people need more toner, and here are things that the sysadmins didn't even realize would be trying to beacon out.
Yep. Yeah, I think that highlights I think sometimes you don't even know you're looking at IoT. And what's scary is you would hope in all enterprise cases, it's all a tight enough process to identify all those kinds of signals. But that's also my point about it breaks down your prior assumptions. You just don't think to look for that, right?
Sure.
And how difficult would it be to build the manual that tells the auditor every possible signal to look for? It becomes an epic challenge that I think shouldn't really, and that's what our team's tact has been in our kind of guidance. It's not all one-sided on the customer. It's not like these devices are just being out the fire hose. You got to use them as they come. There is a role, a responsibility even maybe around how they're developed, how they're designed. Like you said, SBOM or just sort of general transparency in general is a good example of where there can just be better action on one side to inform the other and avoid even that kind of issue.
Yeah. So Mike, you're describing a really complex dynamic environment. So what resources are available? How can you assist federal agencies in securely incorporating IoT into their information systems?
So you mentioned it early on, the risk management framework and the cybersecurity framework. Those are two great, bedrock. They apply to everything. So if you're picking up an IoT device, because a lot of it's awareness, right? Like just realizing you're looking at something with internet connections. And then taking those documents and using them maybe in a way you don't usually use them, thinking about them very critically and going through the risk assessment of that device as you connect it to your system. That's my top line, of course. Go to those as your starting points. Beyond that, of course, as listeners, I'm sure know, there are many special publications, SPs from NIST and NIST IRs that cover all sorts of areas that may be pertinent to an IoT device once you start digging into how it works and understanding what you may need to concern yourself with. Cloud, for example, mobile application development, not in-house, but understanding what sort of security there might need to be around the app itself that controls the IoT device and how that interplay is all done. What I'm going through at a very high level is all covered in our team's SP 800-213 and 800-213A. 213 talks about establishing what we call device cybersecurity requirements. What an IoT device, if you're a federal agency and you're going to connect it up to your federal system, what it would need to do to meet your controls. And how do you even determine which controls it needs to meet? Because that's another key part of this critical thinking that needs to go or should go into play, right? We talk a lot about challenge of cyber securing, maybe to make it into a verb, these IoT devices, but sometimes the IoT devices are so limited, they die in less than a day. They go out into the air and then disintegrate or are dumped in the ocean and sink to the bottom, can never to be retrieved, except by an incredibly resourced attacker in that case, possibly. I'm thinking research applications, even in smart cities or, development of that. There's uses of products that are just they die so quickly. That's part of your risk assessment. That's part of your risk considerations. Do you need monitoring for years to be padded out for that device? Obviously not. But does it mean that device needs no security at all and you can just dump all your data, any data you want onto it? Of course not. And so it's definitely not, I'm not trying to oversimplify what we talk about. If you look at 213, and we have another complementary document, 213A, which provides a catalog of these device cybersecurity requirements to help, because we understand this is a complicated process that sort of layers on to what agencies are already thinking about and having to do. But that, I think, is what I would point to as the best resource to help guide a federal agency around these challenges if they're looking and dealing with IoT cybersecurity.
Okay, well, that's great advice. Now, you've talked a little bit about NIST's role in setting international standards. We've talked about the role of the marketplace in this one. So, Mike, how is NIST engaging with industry and internationally in efforts to improve IoT security? I mean, you can't do it alone. The federal government doesn't
Certainly
make
not.
most of the IoT. Industry does.
Certainly. So, yeah, that's a great question. We, as I mentioned earlier on, NIST in general is very, I think the most common place you'll see NIST come up is in the international standards space, ISO, but not limited to ISO. There are other international standards organizations that NIST is involved with. But I know our team specifically around cybersecurity for IoT is involved with ISO, has been working in that space on a number of international standards that can help influence more secure development for the most part of IoT devices and products. We also, we're always open to engage with interested parties, whoever comes to the door. So that has led us to working with academics, professors in various universities who are interested in IoT cybersecurity. That gives us a, kind of sort of a finger on the pulse of what's coming up the chain from that sort of, more fundamental research side, and what could be, 5-10 years from now, what we're going to start hearing about as possible this or that solutions. But that also, what's going out there today, we talk with, like you mentioned, the industry as well, private sector. There are many private sector trade organizations that, more and more we see are, the more technology related they are, certainly the more cybersecurity aware they are. And even those that are more generic, we represent these industry sectors, are getting more and more attuned to the need to consider cybersecurity and to get a pulse on what they should be doing around cybersecurity. And that's where NIST also plays a role. Not directly, we don't consult with anyone in that way, but picking up our guidance. Then if you have a question, whoever you are, the listener, if you're interested, reach out to NIST. We're happy to answer your question. I can say that really confidently across our entire organization. Folks at NIST are always very keen and interested to talk about our work. It's part of our mission, particularly as you highlighted, Jim, to help the federal government produce more secure systems. So I would say that is true of anyone at NIST. If you have a question about what they've written, they if they're still around, sometimes folks move on, of course, but their team at least will probably be able to answer questions you have. And I know that goes for us as well. So if that goes for the private sector, then, we do engage with industry and industry organizations whom are interested to understand what NIST positions are, what we mean behind sometimes, because it's not, engaging with us to understand where we're going and what we're thinking, because they respect that, and they like to, as you say, follow our lead in a lot of ways, since then the federal government will also, in a lot of cybersecurity contexts, have to follow our lead. And there's sort of, that I say that not saying that it's sort of forced. It's sort of an agreement that everyone's moving in the right direction. And in those engagements, I'll say, we're usually all on the same page. It's about, sharing information and sharing experiences and making sure the work speaks to as many audiences as it can.
So, and I know that the federal government has the power of the purse. The federal government you can't dictate standards the private sector must follow, but do you think NIST is in a position to say these are standards on IoT that the federal government should adhere to? Can you shape behavior by the private sector, by the marketplace, by using a tool like that?
So NIST is generally keen to provide guidance, unless we're directed otherwise, or there's some other structure above what happened, that happens outside of NIST. Our work is informative. It's meant to help whoever picks it up understand the problem maybe that's being discussed, and the solution maybe that's also being discussed, or the kinds of solutions in many cases that are appropriate for such a problem. I say that as sort of a bit of a disclaimer, right? Because that outside structure can exist where NIST's work does take a more prominent role. So SPs, for example, on these 800 series SPs are meant to be sort of the required reading, we'll say, and required use by federal agencies via OMB, not via NIST,
Correct,
to secure federal systems. And so in that case, and that influences how we write them, of course, right? Because if our work is generally taken from a stance of informative, it allows us to have a certain amount of flexibility and candidness in how we discuss certain issues that may be otherwise, very complicated. And if you say the wrong words in the wrong context, can create complications for how that sentence gets interpreted, frankly. Whereas if you're saying it in a more academic sense, everyone gets, oh, okay, there's sort of an insightful statement about cybersecurity, not the guiding principle. So when we're writing an 800 series document, like we did with 213 and 213A, we keep that in mind, and we write that with an eye on driving good behavior and good practice in the federal government. But also with a mind for any organization may pick these documents up, right? Like, again, because of that external context, agencies have to read and use 800 series documents. But it doesn't preclude any other organization outside of the U.S. Or within the U.S. in the private sector from picking up the 869, many do, to secure their own systems. And so we also write with a tone of how you can use this document. They're still sort of, I guess I call them textbooks. You're not picking up a legal document, you're picking up a textbook on how to do something. And it's kind of why I lean more towards calling them required reading and that kind of thing. But in that way, I would certainly influence how federal agencies approach cybersecurity, and NIST has a keen understanding of that.
Yeah. So here's an impromptu question, and that is, how much do you collaborate within NIST? For instance, you've got other series, 53, 207, things that talk about supply chain. Do you provide input on IoT, either as a direct issue or simply to say, okay, as you're constructing something here about supply chain integrity, we can provide a use case or talk about whether this broad approach does or doesn't work for IoT? Do you have, I'm assuming, I know what your answer is going to be, but you've got multiple things all working in the same direction in NIST.
Certainly, it's as robust as it could possibly be, given limited person hours, of course. So it is certainly one of the guiding principles at NIST to avoid, certainly one of the guiding principles to our charter, our mission, to avoid redundancy in what we put out, right? We don't want to be duplicative across different efforts. And so there is a lot of effort to ensure that if there is, crossover, which there always will be, it's at the very best aligned. So that way there aren't, well, if you're in smart grid world, you do it this way, but then if you're in this world, you do it this way. Unless that's, part of the broader understanding of a framework, right? There could of course be there isn't one size fits all, but they need to be guided by an overarching understanding. In this case, they have IoT implications, right? And so there are regular efforts where we engage with other groups, who's the lead, right? So we're working on our work. If it touches on, many times say we touch on risk management. So we are regularly engaged with the risk management framework team here at NIST. They're in a separate division. So that's only one hop away. They're still within our lab. But there have been times as well where other labs have been working on certain things. The physical measurement lab, for example, essentially IoT sensors for microscopic and atomic measurements and that kind of thing. That sort of whiz bang technology. And they consult with our division, computer security division, and others at NIST in the information technology lab to make sure they're understanding the cybersecurity implications, both of IoT and then of general just cybersecurity of that particular example of that idea. And so that sort of thing happens all the time, and there is a lot of conversations across NIST and review of documents at the bare minimum to ensure alignment. So that way, if you pick up one SP especially, but really any NIST document, you pick up one and then go compare it to another, they really shouldn't be saying conflicting things for sure. And it may not be clearly played out, but I know I always see NIST's work having a higher level order and a higher level interconnection that once you start to see it and realize it really all ties it together as a broader corpus. The best example I'd give it as is if you were to read to SP 800-213, one of the sections goes through kind of how IoT might have implications for the broader risk management framework and all of the documents you may be using related to that, just to go to show, you take one thing and it has a sprinkle across all of what NIST has already done in one way or another. And so there's a lot of potential and therefore a lot of collaboration across groups and labs and all.
Okay. So Mike, to wrap up this podcast, do you have any recommendations or at least any final words for our viewers?
So I think when it comes to IoT, if you were to take out all context, I think this is, you don't know anything else about what you're doing. You're at home, you're at work, it doesn't really matter. Be mindful of cybersecurity. I mean, I know that seems just sort of simple, but it's kind of like that engineering idea, you can't, it's easy to let it slip out of your mind for too long. And of course you can't have it on top of mind constantly forever. We can't all be security engineers, but we all kind of have to be security engineers if you're in this space. And around IoT, that's especially pertinent. Like you were highlighting, Jim, you don't know if you're looking at a computer. So just maybe even assume you are and think about how whatever it's asking you for, however you're doing it, there could be some security implications. And that's not to make folks paranoid. It's not to make you question everything you're doing when you're pressing buttons, but it's a, like I said, mindfulness of I'm typing an email address into something here. I'm giving a phone number to this app, and now that's in the database. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you can't get around it, but being aware of it and just thinking about that as you go about your day to day, as you're doing things, I think just makes you aware and makes you makes you more able to catch when there is something more glaring. When you are saying, this is asking for more information than I normally have to give, or this product seems to work in a very strange manner, that might be the perfect intuition you need to avoid actual issues and actual threats that may be there without, cybersecurity situational awareness is what I would preach in that context. And around IoT, that really means just realizing you're dealing with a computer in many times, because you're limited even more from there as to what you could do otherwise. So, and then my secondary piece of advice, but you already said it, Jim. That's why I had to come up with this other one on the fly, is you don't always have to connect it. Now, that's not to scaremonger from using smart technology, IoT, but you had said earlier, sometimes we just connect it for the sake of, hey, this is a cool thing, I want to connect it.
Well, I think that's the
through.
manufacturers, Mike. I mean, I don't know that, and I'll make another silly
fair.
example that hopefully you won't tell me has been used. If my potato chip can, that it is going to tell me how many chips are left, and yet it's talking to my network. If that's what the new Pringles can has, I may not even be aware that I'm introducing a vulnerability. So I think my biggest concern, Mike, is I don't know what I don't know, including when IoT is now in my environment. I think we saw that in the pivot to remote that all of these agencies made, that not only are small office, home office networks that the workforce was using less secure, but they had all of this IoT, and it's not just Ring doorbells and the things that we brought in because they were connected. It was some of the other consumer things that had the things that we didn't know had IoT and telemetry and internet access in them. That's what worries me.
That's fair. So yeah, I guess my advice is slightly different, because there's both ends to that, right? If you're a manufacturer, if you're listening to this and you're a manufacturer, bolt on the smart connectivity where it makes sense. There's a driver for that, though, many times, for it to be sort of hidden, not necessarily on purpose, but because there isn't necessarily, there's no benefit to the consumer for it, but there's a benefit to the business to kind of be able to monitor the how devices are running and things like that. And so sometimes there's that. And so towards that, execute as much control as you can around getting a connected product, right? Like you're highlighting, sometimes you can't even avoid it, or it happens without you ever even noticing or even trying actively not to do it. But there's also the side of, like you said, I want or not like you said, I guess, the sort of the consumer side of what you were describing of, if it can be connected, why not? Especially if it's not much more expensive. But not much more expensive could also mean maybe not very secure. It was bolted on as part of the manufacturer's swing their side of, hey, why not? So just, part of mindfulness is mindfulness of connectivity, and do you really need it to be connected? And turning off what you don't need wherever you can as well. It all goes towards reducing vulnerabilities, both in enterprises and at home.
Yeah, I think that would be good advice in both environments. Agencies should look in their environment. They're sophisticated enough to do a Wi-Fi survey, but at least home users probably ought to look and see what devices are connecting to my network. And if there are things I don't know, then I probably ought to figure out what they are.
Yeah, and don't panic. Could just be, like you said, your TV actually connects to the internet, but that's good to know. Exactly. Yeah, it's just good to be monitoring and to be aware.
Yeah. Well, Mike, my thanks to you for appearing on this ATARC Federal IT podcast, and my thanks to you and the audience for watching. Stay safe and join us again next month for another discussion of how the federal government is adjusting its IT and security to deal with the current hybrid environment and the new normal, which of course will include a lot more of this IoT Mike's been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you.